Hello, this is Dave here with a look at PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds for mobile. This is PUBG Exhilarating Battlefield. It's essentially the full-fat console-style PUBG experience, but one that has been re-engineered specifically for mobile platforms. That means we're getting the same massive open-world environment set on the same island that's present on Xbox One and Xbox One X. It's basically the full-fat experience, but with certain aspects streamlined to run on mobile platforms. Pretty much the majority of key landmarks are here, all the buildings can be interacted with, and the core level layout is virtually the same, with only a few small tweaks to facilitate gameplay on the small screen, but of course with reduced graphical quality. It's pretty cool and indeed fascinating to see this running on a mobile device. And in terms of which mobile platforms the game is available on, you can pick up the title on either Android or iOS. But for this video we'll be concentrating on the Android release running on high-end mobile phones such as the Galaxy S8 and the Razer Phone. Now before we continue, it's worth mentioning that this game is only available in China right now, and accessing the game requires something of a workaround to do so, so it's not exactly straightforward. And of course it's worth bearing in mind, because you're playing on Chinese servers, there is likely to be some kind of impact to performance due to the increased ping and latency when playing on servers halfway across the world. So it's likely that you'd experience more rubber banding and potential stutters than if the game was playing in native servers in your territory. But that said, the game's still worth looking at, as it's pretty cool to see the full-fat PUBG experience available on a mobile device. Now it's fair to say that this isn't an exact one-to-one replica of the full PUBG experience visually. There are significant cutbacks to run on mobile platforms, both in order to get the game running on weaker hardware, but also to facilitate very different gameplay. On the mobile version you're playing on a small screen, which means that having the same level of visual complexity as the PC or Xbox One versions could actually harm the experience, making it more difficult to track enemies and see what's going on. In that respect, the conversion is somewhat interesting, as these considerations have been taken into account when developing the game for on-the-go play. So to get stuck in, the most obvious changes come with a few basics. Things such as windows are no longer present in the buildings and the interiors are largely stripped out. There's the occasional sofa or bed, but pretty much nothing else. And if we go outside, a similar paring back of detail is also seen. So if we take a look at this power plant area here, there are lots of changes. You'll note that the pipework going across the path is completely absent on the mobile. And if we look at the path itself, there's also a difference too in terms of overall grass coverage. The fence position to the left of the path is also completely omitted on the mobile version. It seems that only the key fences surrounding certain areas actually remain in the game. And then if you look to the far distance, there are considerably more objects present on the full-fat console and PC releases. Indeed, if we move forward, the area itself is considerably more barren on the mobile version. Fences, small walls and vehicles have been completely culled here. There's one solitary car that gets randomly placed, but there's considerably less going on compared to on the full-fat console releases. It's also the same in this scene. The small picket fence in front of the buildings is completely absent, and the buildings themselves also feature reduced complexity, particularly the building on the right here. It's kind of an interesting change and kind of serves two purposes. On the one hand, the removal of all this extra detail allows the game to scale down onto weaker hardware more easily, but on the other it kind of benefits gameplay on a small screen. Essentially allows you to move around the environment more easily due to the reduced amount of clutter, and this also makes it easier to spot enemies too. You're getting the same PUBG style experience as you would on consoles, but one that's tailored more specifically to the limitations of mobile platforms, a smaller viewing area where the actual screen is used for controlling the action. The only downside is that seeing enemies from a distance on the small screen is kinda difficult, and this is made worse by the poorer image quality on mobile. There's more pop-up and shimmering, and sometimes you can mistake environmental objects as other players or vice versa if you're not too careful. The game runs at 1472 by 828 resolution on our Samsung Galaxy S8 before being scaled up to the phone's native 2960 by 1440p display. This can create some mild flickering around distant scenery such as buildings and foliage, which you could sometimes mistake for other players or objects. Something that's not so much of an issue when playing on consoles on a large HD TV. In terms of how it compares on a visual level to consoles, we've matched up a number of comparison points between the Xbox One X PC and the mobile version, and it's quite illuminating. When looking at all three versions, it's clear that while the mobile game does indeed replicate the majority of the experience quite closely, there have been significant cuts in visual quality in order to replicate the game on weaker hardware. Take this ruins area for example. You'll notice that the basic structure of the fallen temple and surrounding castles are very similar on mobile. However, geometry complexity is reduced significantly, with less unique individual details in terms of the brickwork, and a lot of the surrounding rubble and stonework is also removed from the scene as well. You get the impression we're looking at the same basic structures, but without quite the same level of detail. The level of foliage, debris, and other incidental details are all pared back considerably on the mobile version. This scene is another good example of what's going on. You'll note that the basic castle brickwork has a similar shape on mobile and the wooden crates are in place. But if you look to the left, the debris of the demolished wall are completely removed on mobile, with only a little bit of stonework remaining on the floor there. The ruined castle wall to the right is also heavily simplified in terms of geometry complexity on mobile as well, lacking the intricate steps of destruction present on the PC and Xbox One X release. The individual brickwork and complex normal mapping is replaced by more flat textures and angular geometry. Draw distances are also significantly pared back. If we look at the mobile version compared to Xbox One X, and you'll notice that a lot of the distant scenery including trees, buildings and other environment objects gets completely culled on the mobile game. Higher quality textures are reduced with soupy low resolution bitmaps, and the environment appears pretty barren as a result. When it comes to the mobile version, a lot of the high quality details only appear up close, and even then at reduced settings compared to what we'd see on console. That means that level of detail transitions are also far more aggressive on mobile as well, leading to more visible pop-up of various elements of the scene, whether that be shadows, foliage, or even bitmaps as they swap in from lower to higher quality assets. Other aspects such as the lighting and post-processing pipeline are also dialed back. On consoles and PC, the world is illuminated quite beautifully at times, with things such as HDR style bloom effects, light shafts, and ambient lighting that really adds quite a lot of depth to the look of the game. Whereas if we look at the mobile version, the lighting model is simplified considerably. Direct lighting takes point here, with illumination appearing harsher than on PC and Xbox One, leading to environments appearing flatter in terms of how they are lit and shaded. It's a necessary downgrade given the hardware limitations of the platform. However, on the plus side, the simpler lighting model also works quite well here, allowing buildings, walls and other structures to stand out more clearly than on consoles and PC. It's something that makes sense when viewing the game on a small screen. It's impressive to see PUBG running across mobile platforms, and the fact that the core experience actually works well, really well in fact, given the limitations of the mobile touchscreen interface. That's something of a revelation. The developers have managed to get what is a pretty complex experience running in a simplified, easy to learn manner, and yet it's pretty much the full game we're getting here as well. Of course, one thing to bear in mind though is the visual quality you're seeing here may differ dramatically depending on which mobile platform you play the game on. Take this quick comparison here. On the left we've got the Samsung Galaxy S8 running with the high settings enabled, and on the right we've got the Razer Phone also using the same high preset, and yet there's a considerable difference between them in certain areas. For example, texture resolution is visibly higher on the Razer Phone, as is texture filtering as well, leading to more clarity across the ground. But if we switch the Razer Phone down to the balanced preset, then the settings become closer to what we get on the Galaxy S8. From what we can tell so far, it appears that the settings options actually differ depending on which platform you play. Perhaps this variance can be explained by the difference in RAM between the Galaxy S8 and the Razer Phone. There's only 4GB available on the S8, whereas the Razer doubles this to 8GB. Either way, it's worth bearing in mind that the graphical quality will vary between devices when selecting the same presets in the display settings menu. And from our testing, it appears that manual tweaks to the game's INI file only appear to have a limited effect in pushing quality levels up. And that kind of makes sense when you think about the hardware differences between these phones. One thing that's worth bearing in mind though is the Samsung Galaxy S8 that's available in Europe features a different chipset to say the one in the USA. The Galaxy S8 available here features an Exynos 8895 SoC versus the Snapdragon 835 in the US phone. That's the same Snapdragon SoC that's in the Razer as well. So you're potentially going to get closer performance between the US Galaxy S8 and the Razer phone than with the European version. Although all versions of the Galaxy S8 still only have half the amount of RAM compared to the Razer. So it's probably not going to solve the texture filtering and texture quality issues. So in terms of the graphics options, what are we looking at? Well, the second tab on the top right takes you straight to the display settings screen, where there are a few options to adjust frame rate and general graphical quality. On the main screen then, the top selection of options deals with the frame rate, and there are 3 options to select. You've got minimum on the left, auto in the middle, and then you've got max on the right. Below that we've got our visual presets, which come in the form of low, balanced, high, and then there's ultra, which as far as we can see is not selectable on the Galaxy S8 or our Razer phone. Curiously, when selecting the high preset, another group of options appears below. Unfortunately, we couldn't find translations for any of these, so kind of not entirely clear on what they do. Although we did note that it was possible to select the first 2 on the Razer phone, whereas on the Galaxy S8 this remained locked at the lowest setting. Anyway, with that said, let's dive into what the options do and the kind of visual quality we can expect between them. First up, let's look at the frame rate. Here we're using the Razer phone for our testing, as when outputting to HDMI we don't get a big drop off in performance. Whereas bandwidth is usually shared between the video output on the screen and the HDMI on most mobile devices. Anyway, the settings are kind of interesting here. We're looking at the different frame rate options. So we've got minimum, auto and maximum. Maximum is pretty much what you'd expect. The idea is to unlock the frame rate to give you the highest frames per second. Basically the potential for the smoothest or most responsive experience. Now, when I first booted up the Razer phone, the game defaulted to medium settings and I was getting between 35 up to 40 FPS at points. But unusually after changing settings to maximum and then even going back to medium, the frame rate seems to be capped at 30 FPS now. Kind of a bit odd. But yeah, the max settings option gives you the highest possible frame rate. In this case, it's around 30 frames per second when using the high graphics preset. And yeah, we're using the high graphics preset with all of the tests here. On the other hand, the minimum option is a little bit weird. It basically appears to cap frame rates at 20 FPS. I'm guessing this is there for users whose hardware isn't capable of running the game smoothly at 30 frames per second. So in order to get a more consistent experience, you'd use this kind of minimum cap instead. But the results really aren't that great. I mean, it's 20 frames per second, which in itself is borderline on unplayable territory. But on top of that, there's a lot of frame pacing issues here, causing unwanted stutters. So it's not really an option I could really recommend. Now the auto option is somewhat more interesting. It appears that this middle option kind of balances the frame rate in between 20 and 30 frames per second, at least on this Razer phone. Maybe this is kind of a way of balancing performance if you don't like lower frame rates and you can't hit 30 frames per second. But ultimately this option doesn't seem to really add any benefit to the experience. So these are the results you're getting with the high preset enabled on the Razer phone. And it's kind of a mixed bag. Whichever option you choose, frame pacing issues do indeed plague the experience. It's impossible to get an absolutely smooth run of gameplay where the frame rate is stable. And then there's these stutters as well, which could be exaggerated by us playing on Chinese servers due to the increased lag and higher ping. So that's something that's worth bearing in mind when looking at these test results. But from these frame rate options, I can say that the max setting is the one that I would choose to go for here. It's going to get you the highest frame rates and thus the smoothest experience on screen, even if that in itself is far from perfect. Moving on from that, let's have a look at the actual visual settings themselves. So for the bulk of our testing, we're using the Galaxy S8, and this is what we're using here for our comparison. There are three options: low, balanced and high, and the level of visual quality does differ quite dramatically between them. Now we struggle to get the balance settings to actually work correctly. Instead, when moving between low, high to balanced, the game seemed to stick to the previous preset, so comparison there wasn't really possible. However, moving between low and high, well, there's a clear difference. And it's fair to say that low settings cuts back on certain visual elements quite dramatically. The most obvious is the complete removal of real-time shadows across the game, leaving more of a flatter appearance to the scene. And this is also made more noticeable by the lack of ambient occlusion too. Light sources are also further pared back as well, again lending to this flatter looking imagery across the scene here. On top of that, we get the usual downgrades in other areas. Texture filtering is considerably worse as well, with what looks like bilinear filtering instead of anisotropic filtering, with clear transitions between bitmaps being visible. Then there's also reduced draw distance and more aggressive level of detail streaming, so there's more pop-up when traversing across the environment. So really, to get the best visual experience, you'll want to play with high settings enabled, since there's quite a big drop when lowering settings down below, especially on the low option. But anyway, it's been pretty interesting having a look at PUBG on mobile. It's fascinating to see a game which struggles to perform well on current gen consoles up and running on a portable device with significantly less hardware capability. I mean, really, looking at it, it is the full PUBG experience you're getting here. And that's pretty awesome. And it shows that while their results aren't entirely perfect, the visuals are heavily cut back when you dive in and look closely, the fact that the game visually resembles the console versions is pretty cool in itself, despite the downgraded graphics. But really, it's seeing all of the different gameplay mechanics, the open world, lack of loading times, everything working kind of as it should, but on a platform that really was never designed to host this kind of experience. The motion controls, in fact, are pretty easy to get to grips with and work very well. The shortcuts there allowing you to pick up weapons, change items and customize your character is actually easier to do on the mobile version than it is on the console releases. It's just simpler and easier to get into. Despite the performance issues and somewhat soupy visuals at times, it's a great game to play on the mobile platform. But anyway, I think I'll leave it there for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.